It was a strange scene at the coffee shop this morning. I was sitting near two people, one clearly a die-hard supporter, wearing the hat, the whole 9 yards, and the other a younger recent grad who looked like they hadn't slept in a week. The supporter was almost shouting, energized, mimicking that familiar rally cry about tariffs and making things great again, waving his hands around like he was on a podium himself. He was absolutely convinced that this economic muscle flexing was the stroke of genius the country needed, but the graduate just sat there, staring at a laptop screen filled with job applications and loan repayment schedules. When the supporter finally took a breath, the younger one just quietly pointed to a graph on the screen. Inflation cooling, sure, but rent prices still climbing, and the national debt racing past $35 trillion. It wasn't an argument, it was just exhaustion. The clash between that giddy political enthusiasm and the cold, hard reality of living in this economy was jarring. It made me realize we're watching a system that feels totally out of place, where stock market wins don't match the paycheck reality, and where the old playbooks, even the ones that supposedly worked in the 80s, are being dusted off and frantically applied to a world that has completely changed. Okay, so let's unpack this. That whole snapshot, that collision between this economic enthusiasm that's based on these past models and today's really stark reality of debt and inequality, that's exactly what we're diving into today. We're going to spend some serious time really scrutinizing why the economic policies that were so popular in the 1980s seem to be falling so short in the 2020s. We're looking at, I think, three major interwoven threads here. First, the practicality and the real-world consequences of trying to apply an 80s-era neoregonomics framework to today's high-debt economy. We really need to know who benefits from these policies now, based on the latest data. Second, we're going to analyze how this deep political division at home is changing the world's view of the U.S., how it's affecting our global standing, and frankly, the reliability of our alliances. This is where, domestic squabbling becomes a genuine foreign policy crisis. And third, we'll investigate whether there are any functional, scalable strategies being developed right now, and I mean things that are actually being tested, not just theoretical proposals, to try and foster some national unity and rebuild public trust amidst all this intense polarization.
That's exactly right. Our mission here is to move from those broad macroeconomic assumptions right into the micro mechanisms of democratic behavior. We're going to be linking the domestic political mood directly to U.S. influence on the world stage. We really need to see not just what the policies are, but what the data says. Who actually benefits? What are the trade-offs, both here at home and internationally?
So we're really getting into the weeds on this.
Oh, absolutely. This deep dive is going to involve scrutinizing the claims about tax efficiency. We're going to analyze some really sophisticated cross-national survey experiments on democratic reputation, and we'll look at field experiments that were designed to literally reduce political tribalism in real time. We're aiming for those aha moments that show you exactly why the old playbooks are failing and, maybe more importantly, where the new solutions need to emerge.
Okay, so let's start with that first thread, the one that feels the most foundational. This constant desire in political cycles to, dust off the 1980s agenda of tax cuts and deregulation, what we're calling neoregonomics. It's always pitched as this guaranteed path to prosperity. But we have to ask, is that supply-side approach still a valid solution for an economy that's burdened by, $35 trillion in national debt? I think we have to start by really clearly defining that economic playbook itself.
Right. And to do that, you have to understand the four pillars. When we talk about Reaganomics, we're talking about a very distinct policy shift that was captured by four main principles established back in the 1980s. The first, and by far the most famous, was tax cuts. And we're not talking about a modest reduction here. This was a fundamental overhaul of the system.
A complete philosophical change.
A complete philosophical change. The 1981 Economic Recovery Tax Act drastically cut both corporate and individual taxes. It notably sliced the top marginal income tax rate from 70%.
Which is it's almost unimaginable today, 70%.
It's incredible to even think about. It dropped it all the way down to 50%.
Yeah.
That single move signaled a whole new way of thinking about the role of the wealthy in the economy.
And then they came back and did it again, right? With a focus on simplicity.
They did. The 1986 Tax Reform Act, that was aimed at simplifying the system even further. It collapsed 14 existing income tax brackets down to just two.
Just two.
15% and 28%. Now, to be fair, that reform did eliminate a lot of loopholes. But the structural reality was that critics argued then, And they continue to argue now that the long-term benefits just overwhelmingly tilted toward the wealthiest Americans and the largest corporations.
Okay, so that's pillar one, the tax cuts. That brings us to the second pillar, because it wasn't just about what the government took in taxes, it was about how much it controlled.
Precisely. The second pillar was deregulation. The administration worked very systematically to remove government restrictions in sectors they believed were being stifled by bureaucracy. Think energy, telecommunications, and critically, finance.
And the argument was that this would unleash innovation.
The argument was that this would lower costs, it would drive competitive innovation, and it would unlock all this entrepreneurial potential that was being held back.
Right. And the spending component, the third pillar, that's often where the policy really ran into trouble. That's what created this debt legacy we're still grappling with.
That's the one. The third pillar was officially reduced government spending. The intention was to curb non-military expenditures. But, and this is a huge but, this pillar was completely undermined by a simultaneous and very significant increase in military spending.
The Cold War buildup.
The cost of the Cold War buildup was just substantial. So you have this tension. You've got reduced revenue because of the tax cuts, and at the same time you have this increased expenditure on defense. That created the major fiscal imbalance that really defined the era.
And the final piece of the puzzle was about trying to create a stable environment for all this growth to happen in.
Yes. The fourth pillar was controlling inflation. And this was primarily achieved through a tight monetary policy that was supported by the Federal Reserve. They were just relentless in their focus on price stability.
And that had some real short-term pain, didn't it?
Oh, it certainly did. That strategy had some very painful short-term effects. It caused an initial slowdown in growth, higher unemployment, but it ultimately did succeed in stabilizing prices. And that price stability was seen as the necessary foundation for any kind of sustained economic expansion.
Okay, so there's the framework. Tax cuts, deregulation, trying to curb non-military spending, and controlling inflation. And all of these four principles were designed to feed into that central theory that we still hear debated constantly, trickle-down economics. How exactly was that supposed to work in theory?
The core mechanism of the trickle-down concept. And this is really the heart of supply-side thinking. It's all based on shifting incentives. The idea is that if you give benefits, primarily through tax cuts to businesses and the wealthy, so we're generally talking about the top 10% of earners, they're not just going to spend that money on, yachts and luxury goods.
Right, that's the caricature.
Exactly. The theory is they'll use that money to stimulate investment, they'll buy new equipment, increase productivity, and crucially, create jobs. And this surge in economic activity at the top, theoretically, would eventually lift all segments of society through higher wages and more employment opportunities. It would result in this broader prosperity for everyone.
That is the theory. So after decades of this, what was the actual long-term legacy when the dust finally settled?
Well, you can't deny the short-term outcomes. They were impressive. GDP accelerated, unemployment dropped, and inflation was tamed. That really did set the stage for a lot of the prosperity later in the decade.
Yeah.
That's the success story that proponents always and correctly refer to. But the persistent criticisms are fundamental and they're structural. First, the policies just demonstrably and disproportionately benefited the wealthy. This contributed in a huge way to the widening of income inequality, a trend that's just accelerated in the decades that followed. And second, that combination of reduced tax revenue and major increases in military spending, it created a persistent budgetary shortfall. And that led to a massive expansion of the national debt.
So it created a structural issue. The government was just set up to spend significantly more than it was taking in. And that fiscal imbalance, driven by both lower taxes and higher spending, it's been a defining and escalating problem for every single administration since. The supporter in the coffee shop might be shouting about genius, but that graduate is sitting there staring at the very real consequence of that debt legacy. So this debate, this whole question of whether wealth really trickles down, it's not just a political philosophy anymore. It's been rigorously investigated. Researchers have put the efficacy of these targeted tax cuts right under the microscope. What does the empirical evidence actually tell us when we compare cuts for that top 10% versus cuts for the vast majority, the bottom 90%?
The data, it provides a very sharp, very clear challenge to the fundamental premise of trickle-down economics. The policymakers who advocate for those top-tier cuts, they're assuming that high earners are the engine of the economy.
Yeah.
They're the ones who generate the necessary investment and labor supply that eventually, filters down through the whole system. However, economists contrast this with the understanding of what's called the marginal propensity to consume, or MPC.
Okay, that term MPC feels really key here. Can you just define it for us simply?
Absolutely. The marginal propensity to consume is, well, it's simply how much of an extra dollar a person receives that they are likely to spend rather than save.
Okay.
Lower income groups have a significantly higher MPC. Maybe think of that graduate in your coffee shop story. An extra $100 in their pocket is almost certainly going toward rent, food, or paying down a student loan bill. That money immediately enters the local economy as demand.
Right, it gets spent right away.
Immediately. A top earner, on the other hand, is much more likely to save that extra $100 or invest it in the stock market or even spend it internationally. And all of those things dampen the immediate domestic economic impact.
So if your goal is to stimulate immediate or even medium-term economic activity, the logic would suggest you should target those with the highest MPC, the bottom 90%. Does the data actually support that?
It absolutely does. The empirical evidence, and this is derived from analyzing decades of historical state-level tax changes, demonstrates that economic activity is substantially more responsive to tax changes that are targeted at lower-income earners. The key finding is this. Tax cuts for the bottom 90% generate significantly more growth, more consumption, and more employment than similarly sized cuts for the top 10%.
That's a pretty staggering finding because it suggests that the political consensus often and maybe deliberately ignores the most efficient mechanism for growth. How small are we talking for the effect on the top 10%?
It's remarkably small. When researchers looked across several key labor metrics, so things like employment growth, wage growth, labor force participation, the effect of tax cuts targeted at the top 10% was found to be statistically small, or in many cases even undetectable in the short to medium run.
Undetectable.
Undetectable. So if a policymaker's stated aim is to increase aggregate economic activity and create jobs, the data strongly suggests that cuts aimed at the top are just a highly inefficient mechanism for achieving that goal.
So if the data is so clear that the bottom 90% is what drives short-term economic activity and employment, why does the political incentive structure still seem to constantly favor tax cuts at the top? Is it just a purely ideological belief, or are there other mechanisms at play that economists are still debating?
It's a mix of really powerful factors. Ideological belief plays a huge role. The conviction that reducing taxes on capital holders automatically translates into investment. That's a very deeply ingrained belief in certain circles.
Sure.
But politically, there's also the issue of concentration. The top 10% hold a massive share of the nation's wealth, and as a result, often exert significant influence on policy design through lobbying and campaign contributions. And furthermore, some economists do argue that the long-run benefits, say 15 to 20 years out, might still accrue through capital formation that's stimulated by top-tier cuts, even if the short-term impact on employment is minimal.
But that's a big if and a long time to wait.
It is. And in an economy that's demanding immediate stimulus or relief, the case for efficiency rests firmly with the bottom 90%.
Okay, let's talk about the specific mechanisms that are driving these different outcomes, because the research is quite detailed on the labor dynamics. We need to get our heads around terms like the extensive margin and the intensive margin.
Certainly. Tax changes for the bottom 90% have a much greater impact on labor market outcomes because they affect how people decide to participate in the workforce in the first place. The extensive margin, that refers to labor force participation. So it's the decision to either enter or leave the job market entirely.
To look for a job or not.
Exactly. The research shows that tax changes for the bottom 90% dramatically affect this margin. For example, a 1% tax increase for the bottom 90% relative to state GDP was shown to lower labor force participation rates by a very substantial 3.5 percentage points. So conversely, a tax cut encourages people to enter the workforce.
And what about the intensive margin?
The intensive margin refers to the decision to work more or fewer hours once you're already employed. And again, tax changes targeting the bottom 90% show a major impact here. Because these groups have less of a financial cushion and a much higher MPC, a reduction in their tax burden gives them both the incentive and, frankly, the ability to work more hours and increase their overall output.
Right.
And these tax changes also showed larger impacts on state-level consumption, which provides that immediate demand boost we were just talking about.
So the bottom line seems to be that tax cuts of the exact same size for the top 10% showed virtually no detectable impact on either margin. Not on getting people into the workforce and not on increasing the hours they worked.
That's the takeaway.
It really suggests that prosperity flows more readily up from the masses through demand and labor supply than it passively trickles down from the wealthy.
That is the core conclusion. The evidence really points to the need for a profound skepticism when you're considering trickle-down policies purely on the grounds of maximizing short to medium-run economic efficiency. The historical record, like the tax changes in 1982 and 2003, which heavily favored high-income taxpayers, it needs to be weighed against these subsequent economic results.
And that discussion brings us right back to the debt legacy. The original Reaganomics framework, while it did stimulate growth in the short term, it created this long-term structural debt problem. And that problem has now grown to an absolutely immense size, and it defines our modern fiscal landscape.
The Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, they provide the authoritative projections on this, and they paint a picture of fiscal strain that it transitions from being problematic to being potentially unsustainable. Federal debt held by the public is projected to rise to an unprecedented 118% of GDP by 2035.
That 118% number is just crucial. To put that in perspective for you, that far surpasses the previous high water mark we reached in the modern era, which was 106% of GDP. And that was immediately following the massive expenditures of World War II in 1946.
Exactly.
So we are reaching debt levels relative to the size of our economy that are historically unparalleled. And we're doing it in a time of relative peace, not during...
Just the cost of borrowing. As the total debt balloons, and as interest rates remain elevated compared to the near zero rates we had for years, the cost of just servicing that debt, it consumes a larger and larger share of the federal budget every year.
So in essence, an increasing portion of our national revenue isn't going toward public services or defense or infrastructure. It's just going to pay the interest bill on choices that were made in the past.
That's the pressure cooker. And when your revenues are constrained by policies like the 2017 Tax Act, that fiscal gap becomes immense. Future revenue projections only increase partly because of the scheduled expiration of some provisions of that 2017 Tax Act. This highlights the really difficult fiscal choices that are ahead. Absent those rising revenues from expiring tax cuts, the fiscal gap would be even wider. And that would force policymakers into a really painful choice between deep cuts to popular programs or massive new tax hikes.
So if the modern application of this old economic playbook generates massive debt without maximizing shared prosperity, and the data suggests it doesn't, then that fiscal unsustainability isn't just a math problem here at home. It's a profound reputational problem abroad. And I think that brings us perfectly to our next major section.
It does. We're transitioning now from the balance sheet at home to the global reputation of the United States. The inability to get our fiscal house in order, combined with years of this intense domestic political infighting, it creates profound uncertainty for our allies and our partners. So we need to figure out if simply knowing about U.S. political chaos actually hurts our global influence.
And this issue has been dominating international headlines for years now. Reports of contested elections, high-profile political violence, legitimacy crises, government shutdowns. The question for the rest of the world and for researchers is whether this U.S. democratic backsliding erodes our ability to lead and cooperate on the global stage.
This is the core scholarly concern. Democratic backsliding. And that term encompasses challenges to election integrity, crises of legitimacy, political violence. It's believed to diminish U.S. soft power.
Can you define soft power for us?
Soft power is the capacity to promote cooperation and achieve the outcomes you want through attraction, through favorable attitudes, and through shared values, rather than through coercion or, hard economic leverage. It's the power of being admired.
So researchers designed a clear test for this. They decided to show foreign citizens evidence of U.S. democratic decline and then measure the causal effect it had on their attitude toward the U.S. What did they find?
They fielded these highly sophisticated multinational survey experiments across 12 different democracies, including key allies in Europe and Asia. They surveyed over 11,800 respondents. And the results were stark, and they were very consistent. Exposure to specific information about U.S. democratic backsliding causes a statistically significant decline in favorability toward the United States among foreign publics.
Okay, how substantive was that effect? And was it specific to democracy, or does just any bad news about the U.S. cause a decline in how people see us?
The decline was measurable and moderate, but critically, it was highly specific. The information treatment, it decreased participants' ratings of U.S. democracy and their perceptions of our government stability and U.S. strength. But, and this is key, the treatment did not significantly shift their answers to questions about non-political institutions.
Like what?
Like the quality of U.S. universities or the reputation of the U.S. military. Those ratings held steady.
Okay, let's zoom in on that critical detail for a second, because that kind of flips a core assumption on its head. Did they test alternative negative information? Like, what if they just heard bad news about the economy?
They did exactly that. They tested an alternative treatment that contained damaging information specifically about the U.S. economy declining, things like a significant drop in GDP growth and a rise in debt, for instance.
And
the information about economic decline had an effect that was close to zero. It was not statistically significant in reducing favorability toward the United States.
that is deeply fascinating. So what it means is that foreign publics, these global citizens whose attitudes ultimately shape their government's actions, they separate their view of U.S. economic performance or even our military might from the core value proposition of the U.S.
It seems so.
The integrity and the stability of the democratic system itself seems to be the most seductive element of U.S. soft power. It really confirms what that graduate in the coffee shop knows intuitively. The U.S. is judged on its values, not just its wallet.
Exactly. When citizens abroad see constant reporting on election denialism or the threat of political violence undermining our institutions, it damages their global public confidence in the historically reliable political institutions of the U.S. This directly degrades the U.S. image abroad. It suggests that if the U.S. wants to rebuild its soft power, it has to first repair its own democratic stability.
Okay, so the soft power theory would predict that if our image suffers, our ability to win international cooperation should also suffer. But the researchers went deeper, right? They asked if this democratic backsliding actually decreased public support for cooperating with the U.S. on specific foreign policies.
And this is where we encounter what you could call the influence paradox. Despite that measurable decline in favorability toward the U.S., the same information about democratic backsliding showed little evidence that it decreased public support for policies aimed at cooperation with the United States. And this was tested in key partner countries.
Wait, I want to pause on that for a second because the mechanism here is key. You're saying people in places like Japan, India, and South Korea, they think less of the U.S. government, but they still want their own governments to partner with us on critical issues.
That is the striking finding in their exploratory analysis across 4 key partner countries: India, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea. This policy influence disconnect held true across several vital strategic issues.
For example,
The backsliding treatment did not reduce public preference for prioritizing economic relations with the U.S. over China. There was no demonstrable shift in support for key security initiatives like the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue or the commitment to the Chip 4 alliance.
this really challenges a foundational assumption of international relations. That image directly drives influence. What hypotheses do the researchers offer for why U.S. influence remains surprisingly resilient despite this reputational hit?
Well, the resilience seems to be rooted in structural dependencies and also the absence of viable alternatives in certain strategic fields.
So there's nowhere else to go.
In some ways, yes. In the Indo-Pacific, security guarantees from the U.S., the security umbrella, are absolutely critical and, for now, irreplaceable, especially in the context of rising regional powers. In these cases, foreign publics might sort of hold their nose and prioritize geopolitical necessity over the moral appeal of the U.S. system. Cooperation, particularly on security treaties, seems to be based on hard power needs, not just soft power appeal.
It sounds like, for now at least, the security architecture is strong enough to withstand the political blowback. If you're South Korea or Japan, you need the U.S. fleet regardless of who is arguing in Congress or the White House.
Precisely. The findings do soften the concern that democratic backsliding immediately weakens existing U.S. security partnerships. The cost is reputational, for sure, but the leverage, the policy influence, that remains largely intact, at least in the short term.
At least in the short term.
But this is just the short term. The long-term picture looks very different, and that brings us to the next crucial distinction.
Right. If the U.S. reputation is suffering, but our current security commitments are holding up, the focus has to shift to the future. Allies must be worried about more than just a momentary blip of domestic chaos. Does the type of political division in the U.S. matter for the viability of future partnerships?
It matters immensely, and this is the real long-term threat. Research that was conducted in the UK, one of America's most historically stable and reliable allies, sought to distinguish between 2 specific types of political division. And we have to clarify these definitions before we can look at the results.
Okay, so define the 2 types of polarization that the UK public was asked to evaluate.
Okay, so first we have affective polarization. This is the polarization that's based on social identity, tribalism, and just negative feelings toward the opposing party.
So the hate.
It's the hate. It's the vitriol, the political animus you see on cable news or social media. Politicians using extreme negative language. It's all about personal hostility.
Okay. And the second type?
The second type is preference polarization. This is polarization that's based on a deep divergence in core policy preferences and ideology. This means the parties are increasingly disagreeing on a wide range of basic fundamental policy issues: economic, foreign policy, social law, and they vote strictly along rigid party lines.
So when the UK public was primed with information reflecting both of these types of US political division, which one caused the greater alarm? Was it the partisan hatred, the effective polarization, or the deep ideological difference, the preference polarization?
The UK study found that both types of polarization negatively impacted their evaluations of US foreign policy. But preference polarization exerted a stronger, statistically significant negative effect.
That's interesting.
It is. It suggests our allies are less concerned about the domestic squabbling, the effect of tribalism, and far more worried about the implications of deep ideological divergence on U.S. statecraft.
And crucially, this concern was not about existing security commitments like NATO, was it?
That is correct. Priming them with information about polarization did not substantially affect the UK public's confidence in the existing security guarantee, the statement that the US would come to the aid of their country. So existing alliances were still perceived as stable, which reinforces that finding from the Indo-Pacific research.
Okay, this completely flips the long-term risk assumption on its head. So where did the negative impact concentrate if it wasn't on immediate defense?
The negative impact was concentrated squarely on the long-term reputational consequences of the relationship. They saw a significant decrease in the UK public's willingness to partner with the US in future international agreements.
Wow.
And there was also reduced trust in the US to do what is right globally, and consequently greater skepticism of its long-term role as a global leader.
This sounds like the mechanism of future uncertainty. If the policies of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party are becoming so fundamentally different across the board on trade, on climate, on alliances, then our allies are correctly concluding that U.S. foreign policy is going to swing wildly with every single presidential turnover.
Precisely. The research argues this effect is driven by the perception that deep ideological divergence creates profound future uncertainty. If a new administration makes undoing the previous one's foreign policy its central objective, whether that's exiting the Paris Accord or pulling out of the Iran deal or questioning NATO, it makes the U.S. look completely unpredictable over time.
Unreliable.
Unreliable. Allies view this as a serious structural risk, and it makes them less willing to sign on to any major long-term international commitment or rely on the U.S. as a trustworthy global decision-maker.
So the ultimate cost of preference polarization isn't just a loss of favorability, it's the erosion of long-term trust, which is a much, much harder thing to regain. So we've established that the old economic playbook generates debt and it fails to maximize shared growth, and the political polarization that results from this environment is fundamentally damaging our long-term reliability abroad. The necessary pivot now is to ask, what is the path forward? We have to shift our focus to actionable, scalable strategies that are designed to counter this hyperpolarization and institutional decline.
Before we can even discuss solutions, I think we have to grasp the sheer scope of the problem we're facing. We're not just dealing with simple policy disagreement anymore. In the United States today, political disagreement has escalated into this deep intergroup hatred known as hyperpolarization, and it seriously jeopardizes the viability of the democracy itself.
What are the specific, tangible behaviors that define this crisis? What does it look like on the ground beyond just, aggressive rhetoric?
The behaviors are deeply corrosive, and they really threaten the rule of law. Political agendas often focus almost entirely on undoing the policies and programs of the other side. It prioritizes political warfare over genuine policy consideration. We're also increasingly seeing the use of what are called lawfare tactics. That means using the legal system explicitly as a weapon to hinder, suppress, or even imprison political opponents, rather than just using it to resolve legal disputes. And furthermore, political violence and the persistent threats of violence, they're starting to undermine the willingness of regular citizens to take on public service roles, which is absolutely essential for a functioning democracy.
So this is not a problem that can be fixed with a simple call for more civility. It's a complex, multi-layered conflict. What makes resolving a conflict of this type so intractable?
Researchers identify several key complexity factors. First, you have the difficult core disagreements themselves, issues like gun rights or abortion, or the role of the state in the economy, where compromise feels almost impossible to people. Second, there are overlaying conflict handling problems. This means that even when people want to find a compromise, the mechanisms or the political structures make it virtually impossible.
The system itself prevents it.
Exactly. Third, there's the astonishing scale of a society-wide conflict. We're talking about millions of independent actors all across a continent. And finally, and this is a big one, we have to factor in the deliberate actions of bad faith actors, those who actively seek to undermine democracy and collaboration for their own personal or political gain.
Facing a crisis that's this complex and this vast, the traditional approach, waiting for a single charismatic leader to save us or implementing some simple one-off policy change, it seems hopelessly inadequate to solve a problem that involves millions of decentralized decision makers.
It is entirely insufficient. The solution demands that we move away from that simplistic top-down us versus them thinking and toward a collective complexity-oriented effort. We have to move past the despair that comes from just dwelling on the problems and instead cultivate optimism by showing a realistic and workable path forward that requires everyone to contribute.
Okay, so how, structurally, do you even begin to approach a problem that requires solutions in so many different areas? Legal, social, technological, educational, and involves millions of actors.
This is where a structural framework known as the Massively Parallel Strategy, or MPS, comes into play. This strategy recognizes the immense scale and complexity of the problem and dictates that no single person, no single organization, no single action can solve it. Instead, it calls for a highly coordinated division of labor.
What exactly does massively parallel mean? Can you give us an analogy to sort of anchor that abstract concept?
Yeah, think of it like a decentralized natural ecosystem, or maybe a vast modern computing network. In a computer, parallel processing means that many different processes are all running simultaneously, and each one is solving a small piece of a huge problem.
Okay.
In democracy repair, MPS means many different people in many different roles pursuing many different projects simultaneously, all contributing to strengthening the democratic fabric.
So the burden is shifted. It's moved from finding the singular fix to creating an ecosystem where hundreds of smaller fixes can all reinforce each other.
Exactly. The primary goal is to fundamentally transform the societal environment. And the necessary division of labor is so extensive that researchers have identified over 50 distinct roles that need to be fulfilled to make this work. That just indicates the scope of this collective effort.
50 distinct roles. Can you give us some concrete examples of what those roles might entail, just to show the listener how diverse the contributions need to be?
Sure. The roles range from the highly technical to the deeply social. They include things like the data analyst, whose job is to track polarization metrics and identify high-risk areas. You have the civic educator working in schools and community centers to improve foundational civic knowledge.
Things on the ground.
Exactly. Then you have the platform designer, who's focused on creating ethical product interfaces that disincentivize tribal behavior online. You have the structured mediator, someone skilled in facilitating high-stakes conflict resolution. And you have the narrative shaper, who is focused on crafting stories and language that promotes a shared identity rather than division. It's a vast spectrum, but the key is that everyone can contribute to at least one of those roles.
That emphasis is really powerful because it completely reframes the problem. It means that while none of us can solve everything, every single one of us can find a solution that fits our capacity and our affiliation. It moves the entire conversation from this place of abstract anxiety to one of concrete involvement.
And moving from that macro strategy down to a specific actionable mechanism, we now have concrete evidence that depolarization isn't just some theoretical aspiration, it's achievable through specific structured interactions.
And you're talking about the field experiment involving that mobile chat platform designed to reduce political polarization.
That's the one. This was a critical field experiment where researchers recruited self-identified Republicans and Democrats and randomized them into treatment conditions. Participants used a mobile chat platform called Discuss It to have conversations with an opposing partisan about contentious policy issues like immigration or gun control.
And the goal was to rigorously evaluate the causal impact of these anonymous cross-party conversations compared to a placebo group that just wrote an essay on the topic.
Exactly.
So what was the core finding? Did talking to the other side actually reduce ideological rigidity?
They found that engaging in these anonymous cross-party conversations led to a sizable and significant decrease in overall polarization. Specifically, a reduction of about 0.22 standard deviations on their depolarization index. And this effect was robust and particularly strong for what they call the issue index.
Meaning their actual views on the issues change.
Meaning participants' actual ideological views on the contentious topics were measurably moderated. It wasn't just that they liked the other person more, their policy positions softened.
That suggests that online tools, which are so often blamed for being polarization machines, can actually be engineered for the exact opposite effect. What features of that discussed experiment were critical to this success?
There were two indispensable mechanisms at play. First, anonymity. The participants chatted anonymously, which allowed them to explore alternative viewpoints and ask honest, vulnerable questions without the fear of social repercussions or public shaming or the kind of performance pressures that are so common in labeled public forums. It focused the discussion on the content of the ideas, not the toxic identity of the speaker.
And second, the interaction had to be sustained over time, right? It wasn't just a quick drive-by comment.
Precisely. The instructions required participants to engage in at least 10 thoughtful exchanges over the course of 1 week to receive their payment. And this finding is crucial. It suggests that the short-lived, high-friction interactions that spontaneously occur on platforms like Twitter or Facebook, they are structurally insufficient for attitudinal change. A sustained dyadic conversation, a real one-on-one exchange, seems to be necessary for depolarization to actually occur.
But the finding about labeling is the most counterintuitive part of this whole study. I want us to spend some time on this. The largest depolarization effects happened when participants knew they were talking to the out group.
It's a fascinating finding. It really challenges a lot of assumptions about dialogue. The most significant treatment effects occurred when the discussion partner was explicitly labeled as an opposing partisan, even if that partner was occasionally mislabeled by the researchers.
And the effect was smaller when there was no label.
The effect was smallest and actually non-significant when no partisan label was given at all.
Why would explicitly labeling someone as the enemy lead to more depolarization than just letting them chat naturally?
The mechanism that's proposed is that explicit labels force participants to confront their wildly overestimated partisan stereotypes. Polarization is so heavily fueled by this belief that the other side is extreme, they're hostile, they're utterly alien.
The monster in the closet.
The monster in the closet. So when a participant, who is expecting a monster, is instead greeted by a civil, thoughtful, anonymous, non-elite person, that contradiction shatters the stereotype. If there's no label, the participant might just assume they're talking to a moderate from their own party, or maybe an apolitical person. And that diminishes the necessary stereotype shattering effect that seems to be a precondition for attitudinal change.
Did the researchers see any difference between the parties in terms of who depolarized the most?
Yes, there was a very interesting asymmetric effect. The treatment effect was significantly positive and quite large, about 0.38 standard deviations for Republicans, but it was non-significant for Democrats. And this is consistent with other findings that suggest that polarization in the U.S. has evolved asymmetrically over the past few decades, driven in part by elite rhetoric and certain media ecosystems.
So what's the hypothesis there?
The hypothesis is that this kind of anonymous dyadic conversation between non-elites may serve as a powerful counterweight to that asymmetry. It provides Republicans with a space to encounter views that are distinct from those presented by political elites and conservative media, making it easier for them to find common ground with just a regular person than with a defined political entity.
And finally, what about the quality of the conversation itself? Did the language they used matter?
It mattered immensely. An analysis of the conversation content using natural language processing showed a very strong correlation. Participants who successfully depolarized tended to have chat partners who used more civil language, particularly during the crucial beginning of the conversation.
So setting the tone early is key.
It seems to be. While civility wasn't explicitly randomized in the experiment, the evidence strongly suggests that setting a civil, respectful tone early on is a critical catalyst for fostering genuine attitudinal change across the political divide.
That really brings us full circle. The mechanisms that repair the democratic fabric anonymity, sustained conversation, confronting stereotypes and civility are the exact opposite of the environment that's often fostered by chaotic, high-stakes public online debate. It suggests that the solutions have to be intentionally engineered.
We started this deep dive with that jarring reality of old economic ideas clashing with new financial debt. The evidence is compelling. Applying neoregonomics, especially tax cuts that are concentrated at the top 10%, is demonstrably less effective at stimulating broad economic activity and employment than policies that target the bottom 90%. That playbook generates massive debt, which is evidenced by CBO forecasts showing us surpassing WWII debt levels by 2035, and it does it without maximizing shared prosperity.
We then saw that political polarization isn't just a domestic squabble, it has tangible international costs. While U.S. soft power suffers severely from democratic backsliding, the short-term policy influence is surprisingly resilient, and that's rooted in structural security dependencies. However, the true deeper threat lies in preference polarization, that deep ideological divergence, which signals profound future uncertainty to crucial allies, discouraging them from long-term partnerships and eroding fundamental trust in the U.S. as a reliable global leader.
But critically, we also looked at the evidence that depolarization is possible. And not through wishful thinking, but through structured, civil, targeted interactions. The scale of the problem is immense, yes, and it requires a massively parallel strategy that utilizes a division of labor across hundreds of roles. But the experimental success of civil, anonymous, cross-party chat shows that scalable mechanisms do exist to chip away at tribalism by forcing individuals to confront their exaggerated stereotypes in a low-stakes environment.
We are left with the insight that the path forward, both economically and democratically, depends not on rehashing 20th century playbooks, but on recognizing where incentives truly drive prosperity, targeting the 90%, not just the top 10%, and where focused, scalable efforts can overcome the preference polarization that threatens both our domestic stability and our long-term global standing.